This is a different session, if you want. It's also the last session of the day, but I'm hoping you're going to find it a very interesting and exciting session. And it's called Funding the Tough Stuff. And really it's a focus on how can we move quicker and do better to do the stuff we need to do to deliver on the Paris Agreement. We know that we're moving too slow, and it's going to be tough. Tough to finance things, tough to come up with new ideas, tough to implement new things. And a big part of that is how do we get the public and private sector to work more effectively together today? So that's the basis of this discussion. And we've got 5 fantastic panelists, one of whom wasn't due to be here until I told him yesterday. So I'll explain why Kate isn't here at the moment. But we are very lucky to have Peter Berkowitz from DG REGIO at the Commission. And his unit is behind smart specialization and the role of smart thinking in regional economic development in the Commission. We then have Terry McCallion from Ebrd, and he's the director in charge of energy, climate change, biodiversity as well? No? No, okay. No, not yet, okay. Then we have Jean Naslin, who is the director in charge of public affairs at CaixaBank. Now, they are in a group, if you want. They are, as I would say, providers of funding, if you want. So those are the guy with the euros in their pockets or on their foreheads or whatever. But one of the things that struck me with this, a lot of the dialogue, which I've really enjoyed yesterday and today, it still sounds a lot like finance guys talking to finance guys. And I understand some of it. I'm not a finance guy, but it sounds like a very technical discussion sometimes, and it necessarily always will be. But investing in things often means, or normally means, investing with a different set of people in real places in a different way. And I'm not always sure that the demanders talk the same language. So that's one of the hypotheses of this session. And that's why I'm very pleased to have Amanda Eichel, who's the Executive Director for the Global Covenant of the Mayors, with the backing of Vice President Šefčovič and Bloomberg, which is quite a powerful combo. And she's based in Brussels, but I want her to talk a bit about the mayoral views, the City Hall views of what we're going to talk about this afternoon. And then we were going to have E3G, who were going to talk a bit about the regional transition agenda, but unfortunately Kate, whose picture is there, isn't here because her mum is ill. But luckily, we found Nick. And Nick, who's been on the stage a few times today, but I met him earlier this week in the context of some work that he's launching at LSE with Leeds around just transition, which is very much about a regional agenda and looking at regional futures in the transitional options we have. So Nick is going to talk a bit about that, hopefully. But actually, it's really about a dialogue. So I don't want to moderate this to the nth degree. I want this to be a conversation. I will ask each of the panelists to sort of set out what their organizations are doing and what their views are, and then really want you guys to be asking lots of questions and participate as much as possible. So the event is as good as you make it, if you want, and I'll do my best to keep the wheels on that. There are 2 hypotheses at the core of what I'd like us to explore from the different organizations' perspectives today. And that one is around, we need to do more quickly, but the investment options and the things we need to invest in will maybe more complex very quickly, and that might be a feature of the next 10 years. So while we're trying to accelerate all this stuff to deliver in Paris and meet the next 12-year challenge, it's not going to be as easy as investing in wind farms or LED lighting necessarily. There might be more complex things that we need to do to really move the dial in a city or a blue-green landscape or whatever it is. So that's one of the hypotheses. It's going to be tough, we're going to move more quickly, but the investment propositions might be more difficult. So how much are we prepared for that, and how are these organizations prepared for that? And the second hypothesis is we need to get far more joined up amongst the different parties looking to create programs and create the conditions to invest from a commission point of view as a pipeline right the way through to the private sector. And how do we join up those different elements? How do we fund innovation so that it can be a rugby ball that's passed on to scalable things that we can trial and implement with agility in real places? How do we then create the right environment for the right finance instruments to come in on that? Are we being innovative enough around that? Are we working closely enough? And what do these guys think from their perspectives? So hopefully you won't hear too much more from me, and it'll be all over to these guys. So I'm going to ask perhaps to start, I'll ask from the funder perspective. So I'll start with Peter and then Terry and then Jean to respond to these challenges and reflect from their organizations, each in turn, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And then we'll have Amanda and Nick to do the same. And then that'll hopefully generate a bit of relaxation in the room, and we'll be confident about challenging each other and asking questions. So does that sound like a plan? Are you all excited? Are you all sitting comfortably? Good, go for it. Okay, Peter, over to you.
Okay, Mike, well, what an opening. I have to follow that. Good afternoon, everybody. What I want to do is try and give you a bit of a perspective of where we are in the European Commission, thinking about how we will go about funding this type of activity over the next 7 to 10 years. And we're reflecting very much on how we do it. And I want to give you a sense of where we are. It's not a discussion which is over yet. We still have to negotiate our regulations and we have to negotiate our programs. But there has been some good news. And I think the first bit of good news I would say is in relation to our programs, our current generation of programs have reflected a shift in the type of support we provide. And we will provide for the period 2014 to 2020 about 70 billion euros for the low carbon transition. And this is more or less a doubling compared to what we did in the previous period, was 2007 to 2014. If we look at innovation, around 3/4 of our smart specialization strategies actually explicitly target energy in one way or another. And our funding is concentrated on the less developed parts of Europe, where in many cases the modernization needs are the greatest. We've also achieved a much stronger alignment with what we're doing in terms of our funding and the higher level targets. These were the 2020 targets. And of course, now we're focusing more on the SDGs and the Paris follow-up. So that's the good news. The problem, of course, is that the challenge has got greater. And I think this has been very much the focus of the discussion. And the question we are really faced with is how can we do more with the same amount of funding, or potentially slightly more in the future. And what I wanted to say here is that it's not only a question of volume of expenditure, it's also a question of the quality of expenditure. And in respect of the discussion today, I think we think that blended funding, bringing together different sources of actors, actually offers an opportunity to increase the impact of the spending that we will make. And at the heart of this, and this is very much where our thinking is at the moment, is moving from a policy which is about financing investment to a policy which is about financing transition, which is about technological leapfrogging instead of lock-in, social innovation, new business models, engaging a broader range of actors. And perhaps the most challenging is encouraging behavioral change at a range of different levels, whether you're talking about businesses, consumers, or government. And this has taken us on to a real reflection on how we design our instruments. And here, once again, coming back to this question of potential blending, these are different dimensions which we have to reflect about when we're thinking about bringing different financing sources together. So, moving from innovation to scale up to deployment. What is the appropriate policy mix there? How do we get the incentives right to avoid lock-in? This is a challenge which we face all the time with many of our beneficiaries who look for the short-term solutions to the transition problems. How do we create space for experimentation? As public institutions, we worry a lot about spending the money correctly. But we know that we will not solve these problems if we are too rigid in the rules that we create. And then perhaps finally, how do we encourage a process which has a broad engagement of all the actors who will be necessary for this process of transformation? So really just to conclude, and I would say that we're still in the process of reflecting, and we would say this is a very open discussion at the moment, so I'm delighted to be here today with a range of different actors, is to reflect on how bringing together different sources of funding can be a building block in a new approach to transition for us, and help us increase the impact of our funding over the next 7 to 10 years. Thank you.
Okay, I'll probably go straight to Terry now. We've heard the Commission say they're looking at doing things differently with more agility, experimentation. You tell us about what you see from the EBRD, and then does that give you hope?
Always hopeful. I think, I guess I'll talk a little bit about where we're coming from and where we're going, and focus a little bit on the city model, the Green City program that we've just launched recently. I think the EBRD's had an energy efficiency financing team since 1994, so we're kind of long in this game. We didn't do a lot in 1994, or maybe for the 10 years after that, but then, it became very much systemic in terms of what we did. The reason we had an energy efficiency financing team was we were set up to deal with the former Soviet Union, right, where resources weren't used properly, there was no market pricing for things. So by the time our shareholders said to the MDBs, look, you need to up your game here, we were in a good position to build on what we'd done and scale up. And we've gone on a journey now where around about 40% of our business is in the green economy. Most of that is energy efficiency, a good bit of that is renewable energy, and then some other environmental investments. Now, I was thinking earlier, it's good for me to come back to this island, I guess, and be able to I've never actually worked in Ireland, so I've only ever worked anywhere else. The minister, when he talked earlier, talked about the economy being developer-led and banking-led. That was code really for the crash that came in 2008, when farmers who became bankers lent money to farmers who became property developers, and it didn't quite work out. So from my point of view, my get-out-of-jail card when I came back home was I was able to say that I was a climate finance person rather than a banker. That was my get-out-of-jail card. And that's kind of what we've done. We've worked a lot with financial institutions to retool them in order to finance energy efficiency and take the lead in the green economy. Now, the thing about putting things together, we talk about innovation a lot. In some ways, it's not that difficult. The difficult part really is herding all the cats. It's getting all the stakeholders together. It's aligning the interests. And this model of green cities that we've just launched actually is built upon a long EBRD track record of financing sub-sovereign municipal utilities, very often on the basis of their own cash flows. In the course of doing that, we've built a lot of good relationships with cities over the years, and we've been able to engage with, let's say, the more enlightened cities to do some more joined-up thinking on strategic planning going forward. So what we've done there is we've defined something called a GCAP. It's a Green City Action Plan. We've set out for it not to be, let's say, another report, something that sits in people's shelves, but to be an implementation tool. So we do the public consultation, we do some baseline, we do some benchmarking that covers transport, air quality, soil quality, land quality, obviously CO2, which is then linked to energy efficiency. And then we really set and agree with the cities what they need to do going forward to incorporate these investments into their own budgets, what they need to do in the way of actions to be an advocate to the private sector and to the population, so that we can improve these benchmarks over time. Now, I think there's a great opportunity there. The downside of this is that, there are high transaction costs, and this is where we can work really well with the European Union and the Green Climate Fund in order to buy down those transaction costs. In the cities that we work in, some of them, don't have deep pockets, but if we establish a 5-year plan, and a city like Yerevan has a couple of budget line items for operating expenses over the next 5 years, and its commitment to capital investment, then you can go step by step and work your way through. And the more concessionality or grant funding that you can bring in there, basically you deal with those affordability concerns, and you can push the boundaries and you can push the standards. And it's about, more joined up thinking. It's about also building more of a climate resilient infrastructure in the cities where, there's an upfront additional capital investment. And, I think what the GCAP, Green City Action Plan, gives us there is more planning discipline, more clarity on political commitment, and the ability for the private sector to engage and for the public sector to engage with the private sector on what are the rules, what are the opportunities, and what are the risks, and how do you scale these things up over time. I can talk, and maybe, we've fundamentally got an emerging markets focus. We work a lot in cities in the region of 100,000 to maybe 300,000-400,000 people, so these are small, medium-sized cities. But if a city like Banja Luka can move its district heating system to be fully fed by biomass, cities like Galway and Limerick and others here and other small cities across Europe can do the same, you know. And, you know, maybe they just need a little bit of extra help and a bit of support. But I think we can come with the money, we can come with the funding, but we can also partner with, or sort of partner institutions like the EU, the Green Climate Fund, and other climate finance institutions to make these things work. And I guess that's the way that you can herd cats. You know, you can get things done that way, and you can scale up over time.
Great. Just, could you didn't mention the size of the GCAP and the size of the money you're putting into sort of green finance. Just give me a flavour for that, or give the audience a flavour for that as Ebrd.
We've financed probably about 200 million of projects in 3 cities already where we've completed green city action plans. Now that doesn't cover everything, because in Tirana, for example, the mayor has initiated a campaign for new cycle lanes. We don't finance those, it's nothing to do with us. He's initiated a campaign for people to try and plant trees on their birthday, and you know, they pay part of the cost, and the city pays part of the cost. The Green City, the Green Climate Fund, initially we've approved about 90 million euros of a package that includes grants, and the grants are fundamentally to underwrite climate resilience, which doesn't have a payback like energy efficiency, or at least not one that you can see. We've got about 7 million for technical assistance, so for the actual machinery to produce the Green City action plans. They cost anywhere between 200 and 400,000 euros a piece, is our experience so far. We've completed 3, and we have 11 underway in cities ranging from Sofia to Ulaanbaatar and several in between. And you know, if that 100 million, which we will leverage probably about 5 or 6 times, gets used, we have an option to go back to the Green Climate Fund and ask for a follow-up tranche to do more. I don't think we've got an exclusive relationship with the Green Climate Fund. We're in the market for other partners as well. So anybody who likes the GCAP model can, you know, maybe not on a retail basis, you know, can join the party and help us to do more and scale up.
I hope you guys are thinking of good questions for the panel afterwards as well. You can see the quality of the guys we got on the stage here, so you've got to match that with the quality of your questions. So, Jean, over to you from the private sector banking perspective.
I'd like to start by suggesting that we show the slide and the picture again, because it's very telling about the sort of things that I would like to address. But first of all, CaixaBank, to plant the tree, is a socially committed bank. It is owned 40% by a foundation, La Fondation Caixa, which is the 3rd largest foundation in the world after Bill Gates and an English foundation of which I keep on forgetting the name. And every single penny of dividend that floats from the bank as well as from the other investment of the foundation go into social welfare, into culture, into medical welfare, and so on. So I wanted to plant that tree because it's important with respect to the stuff that we're going to be talking about here and how we're going to use the money. We've heard this in previous panels. The money is there, but it's how we need. It's how we steer it in the right direction. Now, many existing financial products, and people talk about green bonds and other securities, hedges, derivatives, can be retooled to meet the growing demand for green and social investment projects. Now, there is certainly, yes, an issue of regulatory constraints. We are not going to readdress the regulations which have been put in place over the last 10 years following the financial crisis, which have been extremely painful and were not yet completely finalized. Basel is not completely finalized. For you, those of you who are familiar with Basel, there are capital requirement constraints, there are liquidity constraints, there are risk-weighted assets, therefore credit ratings to be applied to the investments, all of which have to be taken into account. But I can assure you, unlike what has been said by previous panelists, that banks are definitely looking into green loans for their household clients. We are, particularly for anyone who does not have access to capital markets, because Europe, should remind you, is still 70% financed by credit, and this is not something which is going to change overnight. Of course, when you're addressing a green mortgage, there are implications on the credit rating. There is an initiative at the moment from the European Mortgage Federation to ensure that the credit ratings takes into consideration the fact that you are going to save in energy, so therefore that should have an impact on the credit rating and on the risk-weighted assets. As far as CaixaBank is concerned, we are the largest mortgage provider in Spain, with 57 million euros in 2017. However, we need to create this stimulus and in order to incite households to invest into changing their homes and going into clean energies. And in a country like Spain, who has gone through a real estate crisis, this is anything but obvious, as you can imagine. So we need the support of the communities, the municipalities, to create that incentive. So should we have joint project in a country like Spain, where policy is a little bit stuck these days, is probably not all that easy. And yes, indeed, we finance SMEs. We're also the largest financer of SMEs, and this will continue to be done by loans. We have a credit line with the EIB for 100 million euros precisely to finance SMEs in the climate change. We also have an eco-finance credit line for a specific project in agriculture. We have also a full area of financial products with one of our subsidiaries called Agrobank to precisely address agriculture in the scope of sustainability. And we also, and I really want to insist on this, we also have a bank which is called Microbank. It happens to be the largest microbank in Europe. Nobody knows that, but it's a fact, and it already provides microfinancing in sustainability. Now, to conclude, because I think this is really important, this is not just about being green for the sake of being green. This is not about green bonds. This is about transition. And the transition stems from helping these people to get out of here to get to the full green, the biomass you were referring to. And for me, given all the technology, all the technological developments which should be financed, by the way, or funded, we probably do not even know today what is clean versus what is not clean. And I'm going to be a little bit provocative, but financing a coal capture system and storage system in Poland, would that qualify as being sustainable or not? I consider that it does. And therefore, when we address all of these issues, we should address what is it that we are going to finance, which is going to get us to achieve the ultimate goal, which is the 2050 Paris Agreement. It's not the other way around. It's not about creating business opportunities for green. It's about going precisely from this to liquefied gas for the new cruiser ships, for buses, all the way up, obviously, to windmills. And by the way, incidentally, and I'm going to conclude on that, we have financed 7 windmills projects over the last few months. I've got the numbers here somewhere. If I can find them. We have financed 7 energy projects for 9.6 billion, of which CaixaBank has financed 432 million. And they are all offshore energy projects, so I suppose they are the greenest.
I'm sure you've stimulated a few questions in the audience mind there with your summary. So we've heard from 3 providers of finance. There's a glimmer of hope, new policy, new context settings, progressive funding of things in difficult parts of the world with some really good insight and some good test stories there, and Jean's set some good challenges out there too. So from an organization that works with cities, and you have a good idea of what their needs and perspectives are, how does all that sound to you, and where are you coming at that from, Amanda?
Yeah, great, and just a little bit of background on what the Global Covenant of Mayors is. So we are at the heart of it a coalition of global and local city networks who are supporting more than 9,000 cities globally who have made a commitment to take on climate change. There are two parts of what we do. One is really the engagement and support of cities in each region, and that largely happens through local and regional city networks who have those strong relationships, who are the mechanism for deployment of technical assistance and support. And then at the global level, in the Secretariat that I lead, but in strong partnership with our colleagues at the European Commission and with global city networks, we're working to figure out the right way to structure resources and support that cities are looking for and that they need. And we really think about this not just from the perspective of finance, that is a really important piece, but there are other types of investment that cities need, which are related to research and data and technology in particular, or innovation. And so what we've done over the past year is really work with cities globally in a series of workshops in each region, bringing together also businesses and academia, the European Commission, but also other governments, to co-create an agenda or set of priorities around research, technology, innovation, and finance, which are really the barriers and the priorities that cities have identified as things that they need to see addressed in order to access things like the financial tools that we heard about earlier today. So this set of priorities is organized around the policy making process that cities take on. So really looking at from the very beginning, why should I take action? And that really relates to the science that they need at the local level and at the scale that they can use and understand. Once cities have decided to take action, it is the what do I do? And so what's the information, the research, the technology, the opportunities that they need in order to identify the right solution for them? The third is, okay, so how do I address that within my policy framework? And that deals with a lot of the implications of particular sectoral approaches. And then finally, it's how do I finance that, or how do I pay for it? And I think that through a lot of the partnerships that we've established, like with the Ebrd and working with the European Commission, also the EIB, the World Bank, really looking at what are the types of blended finance tools that will be able to support cities, and making the connection between the projects that are often identified in a climate action plan and the sort of pipeline of investment opportunities. And in many cases, those don't speak to each other. We heard a little bit about project preparation. There's a continuum of technical support that cities really need from that starting point of developing the plan or the strategy, ensuring that that plan or strategy is actually investment ready. And then within that investment-ready project plan, the feasibility, pre-feasibility, feasibility, and then project preparation ultimately they need in order to access that finance. And what we're identifying is that sort of technical support can be developed through a grant tranche in a blended finance type facility, but that's not necessarily a scalable model. We're looking at that with the Ebrd and with the EIB, but we're looking at 6 to 10 projects in cities, and that's not what we need to do to get to scale. And so looking at different ways to bring in, again, research, innovation, technology, the private sector, in order to help address that in other ways, whether it be through data and information or through learning to build capacity in cities. Because often they have the capacity to develop projects that aren't identified as green, but they haven't made that transition into integrating that into their overall development approach. And so that's just a little bit about where we are, and certainly I think there's opportunities to talk about the connections here.
Are there some places that are fast movers that you think are, talking about today? So where would you go to say there's some really good stuff we're looking at with some of the smaller cities perhaps you're working with?
In terms of projects?
Yes, yeah.
Well, so we, at the global level, focus less in Europe because of the partnership with the European Commission and the European networks who've been active in this. And so it's largely in regions like, or in continents like Africa, Latin America, and South Asia where we're looking. And it is, again, looking less at the mega cities, so the big cities who have different opportunities to access finance, than the emerging market, which is really the priority. And we're seeing a lot of really interesting projects. It's just finding that way to connect those projects, and often it's finding a way to aggregate similar projects, whether they be in the same region or have at least the same type of risk profile. So there's a lot of work in sort of identifying where cities are in their level of investability and trying to pool those types of projects and cities together.
Thank you. So Nick, I know you wear many hats, but try and put your transition-focused hat on today. And I'm guessing the need for capacity and intelligence at the city level is even more of a gap at a regional level often.
Well, no, it's fascinating listening to Amanda, and thanks for asking me to come and sit here. And I'm very grateful to Kate. I'm very sorry to hear about her mother. So I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the work we're doing at the LSE with partners in the context of the just transition. Essentially, my view, and I think the view of our partners, is that we've essentially been looking at the climate change transition in a pretty two-dimensional way. So basically climate and economy, not really thinking about the societal aspects. Within the Paris Agreement, there is a commitment to the just transition. As we are making our process towards a zero-carbon resilient economy, we need to think about the implications for workers and communities in the context of national development strategies. It's very interesting to hear here how many development banks, we've had the EIB, Ebrd, and yourself, Peter, about policy frameworks, are starting to sort of line up on that agenda. What we noticed actually was that the investor community, who have actually started doing a huge amount of work on climate change on the environmental side, had not really thought about this as a process of structural socioeconomic change. And so the work we've been doing has been to understand why, particularly institutional investors, should be concerned about the just transition, the social dimension, and what they can do about it. The way we've done this is through an academic partnership, ourselves, LSE, with the Initiative of Responsible Investment at Harvard, and working in partnership with the Principles of Responsible Investment. They gather about $80 trillion of assets, and also the International Trade Union Confederation under the leadership of Sharon Burrow, who has been promoting the concept of the just transition. So in a sense, we know that the transition is a very, very good news story. Net, there are going to be more jobs, better health, and so on. So net, that's good. But we know that there are going to be transitional issues, and we know that there are going to be sectoral and also particularly regional issues. And so as well as stranded assets, which investors are thinking about, when you think about stranded workers, stranded communities, and stranded countries. In our region, potentially regions of Poland, but let's think about South Africa, Colombia, Russia, and so on. So this is a very serious issue. So in terms of the why should investors be thinking about it? I think clearly there's a systemic risk issue. Investors know that climate change is a systemic risk, but there's increasing evidence that actually inequality is also a systemic risk, work coming out of the IMF. If climate change action is going to at least exacerbate and potentially actually and exacerbate questions of inequality, that could be systemic risk for investors. There's a question of sort of fiduciary duty, and particularly thinking about the beneficiaries of pension funds, and also alignment with societal goals. What can investors do about it? They can engage as stewards and owners of companies, the companies which may be owning some of these assets above us. Investors are being asked to engage on the TCFD. If you read the TCFD carefully, the human is completely absent. There is nothing about the workplace, almost nothing about health and safety, nothing about skills, nothing about transition, nothing about dialogue. So we've got to really add in that human dimension to the dialogue that investors are having with companies, including with banks. Because I agree with you that actually banks are in the commercial sphere are closest to these regions. They can allocate capital. Investors can allocate capital. It's much easier, as we've heard in various sessions, the last session, sustainable infrastructure, real assets, sustainable infrastructure in terms of real estate and so on. And I think we can think about maybe a new generation of green bonds, which also are focused on particularly regions in need and sectors which actually are going to need the smart specialization, Peter, that you were touching on. And then there's policy dialogue. investors are engaging with policymakers, put a price on carbon, support renewables development and so on. And it's right, I think, to be talking about this dimension as well. Interestingly, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which many of us might know about, to try and move away from coal, has no social dimension. No social dimension at all. So we've been talking to them, again, how can we work with leading policy banks, as we heard here, with cities and so on, to actually bring that social dimension in. We're doing particular place-based work. This is where we met in the UK, focused on Yorkshire, very high carbon region, and they're working with the trade union movement, with the universities, businesses and investors, and so on. What is interesting is, I think, the engagement, very rapid engagement. This is only this year's work we've had with the investor community. We now have about $4 trillion of assets from investors who are committed to action in this area. We have investors such as Aviva, who are represented here, BNP Paribas, DWS from Germany, Generali from Italy, the New York City pension funds, and also the Church of Sweden. So a nice range of funds who realize this is tough. This is really tough. There are no simple solutions over here. We're talking about people's jobs, people's livelihoods, people's identities in very, very profound ways. So I would think that one of the things that we're looking for, again, this is year one, we would very much like to work with cities, with the policy community, with banks. There's a lot of interest from the investor community to work on this. We have a number of real challenges. There is this real spatial disconnect in our economies between finance in financial centers and literally the hinterland. We need to think much more smartly about different types of transition. What I've learned is actually that we talk a lot about the green transition, but actually working conditions in the renewable sector are not often very good. Wages are lower than often in the fossil fuel sectors. It's not a good deal. And then we obviously need to think about how people in these high carbon sectors, how they are involved in that process of change. And it doesn't happen from people externally dropping change down on them. This leads to questions of governance and dialogue, and certainly actually our quality of listening, how we listen to people in these areas. And then two final things. The thing that comes up again and again is this pipeline building. In the meeting we were having, this is in the UK, but actually there's a real intermediation problem. Sorry, that's a sort of technical financial problem. There's a real intermediation problem between the pools of capital and actually these places where it's needed. And that is maybe a problem acute to UK because we don't have a national policy bank, but I think it's probably the same in many other countries. And then I think there is this blending issue. Just to say there is a lot of interest from so-called impact investors in actually trying to link ecological and social issues, so partnerships, I would say there. And then one of my hopes, and maybe we can try and do that next year, is to think about actually particular vehicles, maybe like just transition bonds, where we are actually sort of raising bonds from organizations such as Ebrd and so on, which are investing in, let's say, the revitalizations of particularly sort of high carbon affected communities. So it's been great being here, and really like to see how we could work together.
I'm encouraged that transition is not something we have to argue about with any of you. I'm encouraged that there's lots of good things that are happening, perhaps joining up people and moving more quickly. I'm kind of reflective of the fact that, we look at that 12-year challenge, and by 2030 we're going to have to do a hell of a lot more quickly. And I know when I'm not on a treadmill very often, but when you put the inclination at what we need to do 6 times steeper than we are at the moment, that's going to be, it's hard to have a sort of a discontinuous, easy, managed transition. So where do you guys see some of the discontinuities and things that are really going to challenge, even with the best will of the stuff you're doing at the moment? What's some of the rocks that you're anticipating coming your way? Or is that too difficult to challenge? Anyone want to respond to that?
I don't see rocks. I only see opportunities, because this is all happening at a time of huge advances in technology. So in reality, we don't know today what will be clean in 10 years' time. And this is creating a fantastic opportunity, and it is, you can see it, people now talk about these things, people are conscious of these problems, communities talk about it, municipalities talk about it, households, people, individuals talk about these things. So as far as I'm concerned, provided we can accompany the transition, and this is where I insist on the transition, from there to the green, to the windmill, then we're in good shape. But I would like to add one qualification. This is not simple. And take, for example, the windmills. I mean, the windmills, they have biodiversity problems. And I mean, they are made of steel. So a windmill is not the panacea. It's a good thing. Same thing for voltaic. You're not going to put voltaic everywhere. So what you really need to do is to help communities and people to get from there to the ideal world. And there's going to be a lot of things out in the way that we're going to be financing and which are going to turn out to be extremely positive and of which we are not even aware of today.
Okay. On that note, then, I think...
Let me finish, which is why I have a lot of problem with TCFD, for example, with taking a very narrow approach and with forcing me to disclose everything which is green, green, green to look good at the expense of the rest.
Okay. Well, you've done a very good, you've set some challenges out there that I'm sure have stimulated some questions in the audience. So could we have some questions from the audience to the whole panel or specific? So we've got one lady there, and the gentleman at the back, another lady there. So we'll start with the lady over here. Who's going to get there first? You've got 3 mics converging on you. Wow, that's impressive.
Hi there, Deirdre Lane from here in Ireland. So the Shamrock Spring is a movement I founded. So Nick, I absolutely celebrate everything that you're suggesting here today. As part of the just transition, if we consider all the women in the audience, the fact that we've been underpaid for so many decades, can we consider a policy that will actually positively discriminate in favour of women in this space? Because A, we don't have the money to invest, we haven't been paid the money. Secondly, women are more affected by climate change overseas as well. So I'm sowing the seeds out there. Can we actually set up a vessel to allow the females who are leading the sustainability? A Good Money Week in Britain last month, it showed that female investors are actually better retail investors. So it's time to sow the seeds in positive favour of females if possible.
You're nodding. Is that your answer to that? It's hard not to.
I feel here as an honorary woman because I'm representing Kate. But one of the case studies in the guide, sorry, I should have mentioned we're producing an investor guide at Kapodistrian, which is what these investors are wanting to implement. One of the case studies we have, which is from the UK Development Finance Institution, CDC, is actually how they are matching, so blending both commercial money, their sort of return money but not maximizing return, and grants, by investing particularly in training women engineers in the solar sort of value chain, and particularly it's not exclusively women, but it's directed more predominantly at women to build up the workforce who will be working on that sector, because that's being one of the gaps. So I think that's an example where actually you can get these different types of capital, and where you need to, I think, deliberately focus on particular underserved, underrepresented groups in this transition. I don't know if that speaks to what you said, but it's quite a nice case study which we're going to be featuring.
I think there was another question with the gentleman with the red tie at the back there. Oh, sorry. We'll come back to you. We're not going to forget you. With the lights, I can only see who I can see when I squint. So.
Hi, this is Robin Haag from Alpha FMC. This might be a question for Terry, but happy for anyone to take it. In the US, there's been, for like the last 10 years or maybe even more, there's been PACE, so Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing. In the UK, there has been an attempt at linking loan guarantee to the property instead of the owner as well. Where are we with that in Europe? Personally, I consider that kind of legal structure critical to really finance energy efficiencies on a large scale. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on where we are and what needs to happen.
Yeah,
big question to say where are we in Europe. I mean, maybe you can say something about the sort of broad view. I think in the EBRD, right, I mean, we were set up to deal with a particular region. And if I looked at a country like Poland, which was a country up until 2007, 2008, we were kind of finished in, you know, it was considered to have had made a transition towards a market economy. Therefore, you know, EBRD could step back in our business model and, you know, our long-term approach to being patient at developing investments wasn't really needed in taking more risk. Well, the financial crisis changed that, and we're now very active in Poland, and you know, we financed a lot of the early renewables. I think we're back again now after a bit of a regulatory blip in Poland, where we're back looking at how to finance the grid in order to be sustainable for a long-term input of renewable energy. So there's still a lot to be done, even in, for us, what would be considered to be an advanced transition country. On energy efficiency, we could do more and more and more on things like residential demand side energy efficiency. Technologically, very easy, right? I mean, the measures are kind of clear: double, triple glazing, insulation, you know, heat pumps, you know, renewable measures in the built environment. It's a very fragmented market, right? So how do you do it on scale? So really there, I think we need to equip and retool the commercial banks on the ground. We need to provide them with the funding and the capacity building that they need. And then all of that will help, you know, those countries meet the commitments they've made on energy efficiency targets, you know, through their membership of the European Union, and their commitment to scale up their renewable energy obligations. So it's kind of hard to say where they are overall as a bloc. I mean, we could have a report card that said some are better than others, but I don't know, Peter, if you want to add something.
Well, Peter, do you have something to say?
Well, I mean, just to say, I mean, in Europe we have a lot of legislation on energy performance in buildings. Well, not, this is very much a European approach to it. And these set standards, so that's one driver of the process. But in relation to what we're doing, I mean, we co-finance effectively a large number of national schemes. And it's slightly difficult to answer your question because these are set up in very, very different ways in different countries. But one general issue, and it comes back to this blending question, is that we are quite often seeing, let's say, an over-financing through grant support of these types of investments because they have, I mean, some of the payback times may be quite long, but some of them are quite short. And therefore, we are increasingly shifting towards the use of different types of financial instruments here. And there's a big discussion going on about what is the most efficient form of doing it, particularly when you look at the different types of residential housing you have across Europe, whether you have individual dwellings or whether you have shared dwellings. So it's a very, very dispersed picture, I would say. But there is this one general theme.
Nick, you raise your pen. Do you have a quick addition to that?
Just in terms of a tough issue, this is a tough issue. So as you were saying, I mean, there are energy performance certificates for housing across Europe, and we've been working with banks to actually tag their loan books according to that. The problem is that actually in some systems, although we have these data sets, in some countries, it is not just impossible from a technological point of view, it's actually illegal to try and merge these different systems from a privacy point of view. So there are some actually sort of quite profound issues, not hard in a difficult sense, but hard in actually trying to bring these different systems together between actually the financing of energy efficiency, the regulation and labeling of it, and how you do that in a practical world. There's lots of interest, lots of demand, and I think, Jean, you were talking about the European Mortgage Federation's work, but there's some real connectivity problems.
There's one point here, just again a qualification. There is a lot of European legislation, as we all know. So there is legislation with respect to official buildings, but there is no legislation with respect to private housing at the moment. There is no directive on private housing. So maybe we're addressing all these issues of disclosure from another standpoint, but this doesn't seem to be addressed at the moment.
I'd like to come back to that, but that would be a whole discussion in its own, and I think we've got some expertise in the audience. I know there were a couple of hands down here, so if we can...
Hello. First, thank you very much for all this presentation. I think that for my colleague Fuzi and I, it's been Christmas during 1 hour. We co-developed Origins.Earth. What we do is provide the cities carbon maps to help them identify the key low carbon project and give them tools to ask for carbon credits and energy efficiency certificates on behalf of the inhabitants for home renovation. And well, my question was, we have in Europe energy efficiency certificate schemes. Together with the Paris Agreement, we're going to have global carbon markets, hopefully. So is it a source of financing that you've been reviewing currently for the cities? Historically, they didn't have access to this. In addition to green finance, so do you already work on similar experimentations?
Would you like that to go to Amanda?
I can start, and maybe others can fill in. I think from the perspective of the Global Covenant and the cities, and we work with cities also outside of Europe, but I think there's a lot of interest in the idea of a carbon market. I was just talking earlier today with colleagues here about the opportunity to think about sort of the cryptocurrency around carbon and how that could translate to the opportunity for cities to use that as a new mechanism for finance. So we're absolutely looking at what that could be, but there is, I think, a lot of work to really understand the implications of that in light of national government engagements and other markets. So worth definitely a follow-up conversation, but it's something that I think is just still early on in our analysis. I don't know if others are...
I don't know if I've worked on carbon market transactions. We managed some carbon funds back in the day when there was the Kyoto Protocol and there were compliance buyers and sellers, and we were a good intermediary because we were investing in energy efficiency projects that had CO2 emission reductions, and we could put ourselves in between compliance buyers. Ireland actually was one. They participated in one of the funds. It's actually one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. The challenge, I think, will be for an emerging carbon market is how do you make the rules clear? How do you make the accreditation process clear? And how do you avoid the risk that when you get to the end of that accreditation process that the accreditation entity doesn't agree that it's additional, therefore the carbon credits aren't valid. So I think it's very difficult to start to think about making capital investment decisions on the basis of a stream of cash flows that you're not sure about. I mean, I'm sorry to turn it into horrible sort of banking terminology and language, but the idea of trying to find a way of unlocking that sort of asset and giving it value, whether it's something that is looked at in terms of a shadow carbon price, or whether it's something that is just about really understanding your risks up front related to something like the TCFD. I don't know, but the transaction costs are very, very high, and my experience is the uncertainty is difficult, and it may be a bonus at the end of the day for a city, but I think cities would really find it hard to have the capacity to develop accreditable carbon market transactions. At least I would need to see what the new carbon market looked like before, and then I'll come back and give you another opinion then.
I think the lady in red in the front row.
I would like to ask a question about the demand side, so from a finance perspective, and to all of you, in the sense that a lot of the conversation here is around blended forms of supply of finance, but there is a whole significantly larger, proportionally speaking, market of demand finance. And I would very much like demand side finance and multiple financial instruments, whether it's procurement, thinking about longer term, different timescales and pulling the future forward. I'd be very interested in your perspectives on where and how that is already being pulled into view, particularly where you are dealing with place, where the demand levers are real and connected to context.
Okay, I think that's one for all of you. Who wants to go first?
Well, I would come up with a very simple answer, but I'm not sure that you're going to be satisfied by this. If there is a demand, we address it, and we deal with it because we are close. But this is very much a banker's sort of approach, because we are close to the needs of our clients, and so we will address it. We will find the proper financial tool. We will see what kind of credit rating we can apply to it. But yes, at the end of the day, there is going to be a cost, because all these new type of investments are usually long-term, much longer term than a normal, usual, traditional credit assessment, which is usually over 4 or 5 years. Here we are often talking about 10 to 15 years before it can bear fruit. But we will address it. We will look what impact it has on our own regulations, liquidity, capital requirements, risk-weighted assets, leverage, and there will be a price attached to it. And there is this idea that all these changes are going to be incited by being provocative by some kind of a cheap ride. Is just not going to fly. But again, we're in times of innovation, so there are so many new opportunities and opportunities of savings, which will immediately also impact on the lower cost for some of these instruments that we will put in place. I should have mentioned that, for example, at CaixaBank, all our agents in the branches are now totally equipped with laptops, and we don't use paper anymore. So we are contributing very significantly to deforestation. But this also has an impact on our cost. It's a benefit on our cost. So again, a very simple answer: we will address it.
Maybe to Amanda and Nick, because the demand side, I mean, you both reflected on capacity development, policy, finance, smarts, etc. So maybe you could.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the things that builds on a program that Climate-KIC actually funded through CDP, the CDP Matchmaker program, we're really looking at how to sort of dissect the climate action plans that all the cities under the Global Covenant of Mayors are developing, and look at where there are clusters of opportunity, or whether that be around particular sectors or in particular regions, and if there's an opportunity to bring those together in an aggregate form, whether that's from a perspective of the same types of projects, the same sort of risk profiles, all of those things sort of lead to the decision around what's investable. And then the types of support that those cities, whether in clusters or around sectors, need in order to get that pipeline sort of down the pathway of being ready for investment. And the Matchmaker program at this point has identified somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 projects in Global Covenant cities in particular. Not all of those projects are at the point of being ready for investment. But it is an interesting way of thinking about within that group of 600 that are coming from this larger group of 900 or 9,000. What is the opportunity around and the types of support? And again, how can we think about technical support that doesn't necessarily mean really in-depth work with cities on the ground in every case, because that is not a scalable solution when we're talking about the thousands of intermediary cities that really need this type. So looking at technology, data, innovation that can help to fill some of those gaps.
Quickly, you had some.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly just talking on the UK situation, I think there's a reality of suppressed demand, particularly from SMEs who actually aren't going to banks, and also there's a lack of diversity of offer because you don't have the sort of variety of different banking operations. I think there's another challenge, certainly in some of the cities we've been working with, is also actually how do you get portfolios of projects funded? And one of the problems potentially is that the sort of external investors or lenders sort of cherry pick the nice high return, low risk projects, whereas actually in a city you need that portfolio of projects funded. So that seems to be a challenge, and therefore how that negotiation can happen, because clearly people want to attract private capital, but actually want capital which goes across that portfolio.
Peter, I think you had a...
Well, just very quickly to answer that question, I think we see this as a key policy challenge for us because particularly since our starting point is grants, we have a very strong bias towards the supply side. So the question is, how do you create the forms of governance that allow you to be more responsive to the demand side? I think linked to that is another issue, which is one of deployment. And that we see, I mean, this is perhaps more with my innovation hat on, but there are significant problems about deployment of new technologies in Europe, and particularly where there is a social challenge dimension to them. So I think these are two dimensions which we certainly see as something which we need to work on over the coming years.
I think we're probably getting close. There's someone who's going to get one more question then, if it's a quick one.
Well, no pressure there then.
No, sorry. Take your time, but in as speedy way as you can.
Okay. Tony Rook from CDP. Thank you very much for very interesting comments. One thing I'd like to pick up on, you talked about social side as well, which is also more challenging. I feel a lot of the comments have been talking about mostly on the energy side, and I'd like to hear if there are any comments about things like, for example, from the IPCC report, we're going to have to change what we eat, and cities are obviously a great pull on resources from elsewhere outside the city, not just on the energy and the transport. So any comments on how we actually tackle those from a financing point of view as well, as it's a social change as much as it's a technological?
I'll start, Peter, marrying the social instruments with the cohesion instruments. Where are you at with that challenge?
You were right that this is a big question, because in fact it cuts across a lot of different policies. I think I'll just give you a very, very short answer to this, is that we have to reflect as well on the value chains that underlie the processes that link different parts of our economy. And there, I think, we are reflecting in terms of sustainability, also in terms of those value chains, from the beginning of the value chain to the end. So, I mean, just to say, I mean, once again, this is the more technological innovation focus, but one of the questions that we are looking at in a number of sectors is how you think about moving from resources to recycling in an efficient manner. And one of the most efficient ways of doing that is actually to shorten your value chain. So there is a reflection there, but I'm not sure it entirely answers your question, because you have to start talking about things like agricultural policies, food legislation as well.
Just in terms of agriculture, that's the area of largest employment on the planet. There are 1 billion people working in agriculture, and often where working conditions are worst. And so I think actually agriculture is perhaps where we need to spend most time looking at the just transition, particularly also in terms of the human health aspects, particularly in developing countries, from extreme heat.
Maybe just to add one thing from the city perspective, the approach that right now most cities take to measure greenhouse gas emissions reduction has to do with a production side approach, and we're working right now to think about more of a consumption-based approach in terms of the emissions that are consumed within a city boundary, to really sort of flip the narrative and the considerations around what types of policies and interventions will really have the greatest impact.